They say time softens all things, but for Eleanor Mitchell, time had only taught her to hide her disappointments behind a practiced smile. At 61, after 7 years of marriage to Mark Caldwell, she had become fluent in silence, in enduring subtle dismissals and whispered judgments from his well-bred family in Charlotte, North Carolina. Eleanor was no stranger to hard work. Raised in a small Missouri town by her father, a mechanic, and her mother, a waitress, she knew how to earn her place in the world. She had built a modest but respected career as a ceramic artist. By the time she met Mark, recently divorced, charming, and the CFO of a regional banking firm, she thought life had finally offered her not just companionship, but belonging. But marrying into the Caldwells was like stepping into a house where every room looked warm, yet none had a seat for her. At family dinners, Mark's sister Caroline would ask about her little pottery hobby, while passing around wine she insisted Eleanor wouldn't recognize. His mother, Joan, once asked her, without a hint of irony, if she'd ever considered taking a proper art class. Mark never pushed back. "That's just how they are," he'd say. "Don't take it personally." She didn't. Until that afternoon. It was a humid June day at the annual Caldwell Garden Luncheon. Eleanor brought one of her handmade serving platters, a glazed blue piece she had spent days perfecting. When Caroline saw it on the buffet table, she chuckled and said, just loud enough, "If Eleanor vanished tomorrow, would anyone even notice?" The laugh that followed froze Eleanor in place, including Mark's. She didn't cry. She didn't storm out. But something broke cleanly inside her. Something long overdue. That evening, she wrapped the platter in cloth, placed it in the back of her closet, and sat alone on her porch as the cicadas hummed like distant voices of courage. What do we become when we spend years being polite in places we were never truly welcomed? And at what point does choosing peace mean choosing ourselves, even if it means starting over? Eleanor and Mark had met, fittingly, in a quiet corner of a library. She was hosting a workshop on traditional pottery for a community arts program, and he was attending a finance lecture across the hall. They struck up a conversation over their shared love of old books, and something about his easy charm and attentive eyes made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. At the time, Eleanor was 54 and comfortable in her skin. She'd been divorced for over a decade, her daughter grown and living across the country in Oregon. Her life was quiet but content. She taught part-time, sold pieces at weekend markets, and spent her mornings shaping clay with Bach or B.B. King playing in the background. Mark, 10 years her senior, seemed like a man who appreciated her steady rhythms. He brought flowers for no reason, praised her craft, and loved the stories behind each piece she made. When he proposed a year later, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She believed she was marrying a man who valued who she was, not just what she could offer. But after the wedding, things began to shift. Subtly at first. The Caldwells were old Charlotte money, bankers, lawyers, board members. They greeted her warmly at gatherings, but never asked about her life. Her art was charming, her ideas interesting, and her background refreshing, words that all felt like well-mannered condescension. Mark's world was one of dinner parties and country club brunches. Eleanor tried to fit in. She wore the linen blouses Joan suggested, learned the difference between Syrah and Shiraz, and even helped organize a charity auction for Caroline's Animal Rescue Foundation, though no one ever mentioned her contributions. Mark noticed, of course. He just never said anything. "You know how my family is," he would shrug, kissing her forehead. "They'll warm up eventually." Eventually never came. Eleanor stopped bringing her handmade dishes to family events. They were always replaced by store-bought alternatives anyway. She stopped mentioning her art at dinner. No one seemed interested. She even stopped inviting Mark to her gallery openings. He always had a meeting or a board event. And with each quiet concession, she felt a little less like herself. Her studio, once her sanctuary, started gathering dust. The clay dried out more quickly. Her hands, once eager to mold and shape, now rested still for long stretches. She told herself it was just a season, that adjusting to a new family took time. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't time she needed. It was space to breathe. That June afternoon in the garden, when Caroline's careless remark sparked laughter instead of defense, it became the final confirmation. Eleanor wasn't just unseen. She was optional. And worse, she had started to believe it. That night, after everyone had gone home, and the laughter had faded into distant echoes, Eleanor stood in her studio under the dim amber light and ran her fingers over her oldest pieces. Bowls and vases shaped when she still believed her work mattered, not just to her clients, but to the people closest to her. She placed her hands on a raw block of clay and for the first time in months felt the impulse to create. Not for praise, not to impress, but for herself. As her fingers pressed in and the form began to emerge, Eleanor knew. This story wasn't over. It was only changing shape. The morning after the garden luncheon, Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, staring at a full cup of coffee she had no desire to drink. Mark was already dressed, scrolling through emails on his phone, oblivious to the storm quietly gathering across the table. "You've been quiet," he said finally, not looking up. "I usually am," she replied gently, eyes still fixed on the cup. Mark glanced up then, sensing something different in her voice, less weary, more resolved. "Was it something Caroline said?" he asked, setting down his phone. Eleanor met his gaze evenly. "She said if I disappeared, no one would notice. And you laughed." Mark sighed, exasperated. "Eleanor, it was a joke. You know how Caroline gets when she's had wine." "It wasn't just the joke, Mark. It was the years of small, sharp edges, the corrections, the glances, the way your mother pats my hand like I'm a child she's barely tolerating, the way no one even notices when I stop speaking." "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. She smiled, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "It is. And what's worse is that I started believing them. I let myself become small." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she said softly, "that I need to step back. From this. From all of it." A silence stretched between them, long, quiet, and heavy. Later that day, after Mark had gone to the office, Eleanor moved through the house with deliberate grace. She packed only the essentials: clothes, sketchbooks, a few favorite books, her pottery tools, and the old platter from the garden party, now carefully rewrapped in its cloth. She left behind the dresses she never liked, the gifts she never chose, the silences that never served her. She wasn't running away. She was walking home to herself. By sunset, Eleanor had driven north into the foothills near Asheville, North Carolina, where her daughter, June, lived in a modest cottage on a wooded street. They hadn't been especially close since June moved away, but the call Eleanor had made that morning had been met with quiet understanding. "You can stay as long as you need," June had said. "No questions." Eleanor didn't cry during the drive. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something quieter, steadier, like setting down a heavy box she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years. That night, she slept in June's guest room, curled under a patchwork quilt her mother once made, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without waking in the middle of the night. There were no grand speeches, no slammed doors, just the gentle truth of someone choosing to live honestly, even if it meant leaving comfort behind. The next morning, she made coffee and sat with June on the porch. "I thought you loved him," June said quietly. "I did," Eleanor replied. "Maybe I still do, in some way. But love isn't supposed to make you invisible." And that's when she knew. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, one Eleanor hadn't known she needed. June's home was small but filled with life. Books piled on side tables, a rescue dog named Maple who followed Eleanor everywhere, and the faint scent of lavender always lingering in the air. For the first week, Eleanor did little. She took slow walks in the neighborhood, napped in the afternoon, and made simple dinners with June. It was the kind of gentle monotony that doesn't feel like wasting time, but reclaiming it. She didn't talk about the Caldwells. She didn't need to. One afternoon, while June was at work, Eleanor wandered into the shed behind the house, which June had converted into an art nook for her occasional watercolor painting. It had a work table, a few empty shelves, and a skylight that let in a perfect stream of mountain light. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, closed her eyes, and inhaled the faint, earthy scent of wood and dust. Her fingers itched for clay. The next day, she drove into town and found a small art supply store tucked between a bakery and a used bookstore. She bought a starter kit, clay, tools, glaze, and returned to the shed with a kind of nervous reverence. She hadn't created anything in nearly 6 months. Her first attempt was rough. The bowl came out lopsided. But as she turned the wheel again, something within her clicked back into place. Not perfectly, but unmistakably. This was not about product. It was about process. It was about remembering that her hands still knew what to do. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor's world began to expand again. She joined a local artist co-op in Asheville, where members rented space to work and sell their creations. The studio was located inside a refurbished warehouse filled with painters, jewelers, weavers, and ceramicists. At first, she kept to herself, content to reclaim her own rhythm. But one morning, a woman named Judith, late 60s, spunky silver hair, and paint on her jeans, wandered over. "Your glazes are bold," Judith said, pointing to a series of small plates Eleanor had just finished. "Not afraid of contrast. I like that." Eleanor smiled. "It's the first time in a long while I've made something just for me." "Well, keep doing that," Judith said. "The world needs less polish and more truth." That single comment became a seed. Eleanor began showing up to the studio daily. Some mornings, she would sit at the wheel before sunrise, molding clay while birdsong filtered through the open window. Other days, she'd sit with the other artists over coffee and stories. Divorces, second chances, family rifts, personal comebacks. There was no judgment, no hierarchy, just people finding their way. One day, June stopped by unexpectedly and found her mother deep in concentration, shaping a wide bowl with curved edges. "You look different," she said. Eleanor glanced up. "Older?" "No," June smiled. "Lighter." They sat together on a bench outside the studio, sipping lemonade. Maple lay nearby, her head on Eleanor's foot. "You know," June began, "when I moved away all those years ago, I think I was angry at how much you gave up for everyone." Eleanor looked surprised. "I always thought you resented that I didn't give more to you." "I didn't want more," June said quietly. "I wanted you to have more." The words landed like a slow, warm wave. For so many years, Eleanor had seen her choices through the lens of duty, of being the glue, the peacemaker, the understanding one. She hadn't realized how deeply her daughter had witnessed her erasure. That evening, Eleanor sat at her work table and opened a new sketchbook. On the first page, she wrote in careful print, "Not everything lost is gone forever. Some things return in different form." She traced her fingers over the words, then picked up her pencil and began to sketch. Nothing elaborate, just lines and curves and motion. But it felt like a kind of prayer, a way of promising herself that what came next would be shaped not by others' expectations, but by her own design. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's work began to evolve. Bolder forms, richer colors. She was accepted into a small weekend market in Asheville, and her pieces, infused with story and strength, began to sell. Not fast, but steadily. She was no longer invisible, not to herself, not to her daughter, not to the strangers who held her bowls and sensed something honest in their weight. 6 months after Eleanor quietly stepped away from the Caldwells world, a curious email arrived in her inbox. Subject: Seeking artisan collaborators. Wadsworth Interiors. At first, she assumed it was a generic outreach, perhaps from the local co-op's mailing list. But as she read further, her breath caught. The company was working on a high-end residential design project just outside Charlotte, and the creative director overseeing the campaign? Caroline Wadsworth, Caroline Caldwell. Eleanor read the email twice, then a third time. There was no mention of family history, no hint that anyone recognized her name. Just a brief, professional note. Your ceramic work has come highly recommended. We'd love to schedule a call. She sat with the message for nearly an hour, hands still, heart unusually calm. The irony didn't sting. Not anymore. What surprised Eleanor most was the quiet sense of clarity rising inside her. She didn't need to respond, but she could. And she would. On her terms. Later that week, she joined a scheduled video call with a representative from the firm. A young assistant named Molly beamed through the screen. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for making time. Our lead designer, Caroline, would love to speak with you directly. She was drawn to your Riverbend collection. Eleanor nodded. I'm glad to hear it. The following day, she received a second message. This one directly from Caroline. It was strikingly formal, almost cautious. Eleanor, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm aware of our shared history. I understand if this is too complicated, but your work truly speaks for itself. I hope we can collaborate professionally, with mutual respect. Eleanor didn't hesitate in her reply. Thank you, Caroline. I'm open to discussing the project. Respect will be assumed and expected, as with any client. There was no venom, no hidden agenda, just boundaries set with elegance. A week later, they met in person at the project site, a sprawling lakeside home being staged for a magazine feature. The house gleamed with minimalism and money, but Eleanor found herself unmoved. She was here for the work. Caroline greeted her at the entrance, dressed impeccably, hair pulled back, her expression composed but visibly uncertain. Thank you for coming, she said. Eleanor simply nodded, stepping into the foyer. Let's look at the space. As they walked through the rooms, discussing colors, texture, and placement, Eleanor noticed something different in Caroline's tone. Gone were the flippant remarks, the sharp-edged commentary. She asked thoughtful questions, listened, and when Eleanor suggested a bold ceramic wall installation for the fireplace, Caroline considered it seriously. I wouldn't have thought of that, she said. But it works. It really works. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full of unsaid recognition. Before Eleanor left, Caroline walked her to her car. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Not just for that day in the garden, but for all the years before it. I don't know why it took me so long to realize how cruel I was. Eleanor studied her carefully. It wasn't just cruelty, Caroline. It was dismissal. And dismissal, over time, changes a person. Caroline nodded, her eyes damp. You left, and for a while, I was angry. I thought you were weak for walking away. Now I see. You were the only one strong enough to leave. I didn't leave to prove anything, Eleanor replied. I left because staying meant losing myself. They parted with a handshake, not warm, but real. And sometimes, real is enough. Over the next 2 months, Eleanor's custom pieces became the centerpiece of the Lakeside project. A local magazine ran a spread on the home and included a brief interview with her. For the first time, her name appeared alongside her work, not as a footnote, but as a feature. The article caught attention, and more commissions followed. Boutique inns, designers seeking authenticity over perfection, clients who wanted their homes to feel lived in rather than curated. Eleanor's style, once dismissed as rustic or charming, was now called grounded, textural, evocative. But the most meaningful acknowledgement came one crisp November morning. She was at the studio, shaping a new batch of bowls, when June entered, holding an envelope. This came for you, she said, handing it over. It was a handwritten note from Mark. Eleanor, I saw the article. Your work is beautiful. I've been thinking a lot about our time together, and I realize now how much I asked you to shrink. I'm sorry, I hope you're well. I hope you know how much I admire what you've built. There were no pleas, no invitations, just a recognition, long overdue. Eleanor placed the letter in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but respect. Not all apologies are meant to reopen doors. Some simply offer peace. And peace she had found in abundance. Winter came slowly to Asheville, dusting the mountains in silver and softening the edges of everything. Eleanor had never liked the cold much before, but now she found herself drawn to the stillness it brought. The quiet mornings, the steam rising from her coffee, the way her breath curled into the air like smoke from an old story finally told. By December, the lakeside home project had wrapped, and Eleanor had politely declined several high-profile commissions that didn't align with her new boundaries. You don't have to say yes to prove you're worth asking, she had told June, who smiled like someone witnessing her mother finally come home to herself. Her days were full, but not frantic. She rented a small sunlit space just a few blocks from the artist co-op. It wasn't a formal gallery, just a studio with wide windows, a sturdy kiln in the back, and a shelf of her favorite books beside a well-used teapot. Locals would stop in to browse, to talk, to feel the warm bowls and mugs between their hands, as if they were holding stories. And in a way, they were. Each piece Eleanor shaped now carried something beyond technique. It held resilience, the long, slow courage of someone who had once made herself small to be accepted, and who now took up space with quiet pride. One afternoon in late January, a woman stopped by the studio while Eleanor was cleaning glaze from her hands. She was in her early 40s, businesslike but kind-eyed, and introduced herself as a curator for a regional arts collective. We're organizing an exhibit called Renewal, she said, admiring a set of deep green vases near the window. Your work came highly recommended. Would you be interested in contributing? Eleanor didn't hesitate. Yes, she said simply. I would. That night, as she closed up the shop and stepped out into the crisp air, Eleanor paused under the street lamp, the glow haloing her breath. She looked down at her hands, lined, strong, still dusted with traces of clay, and smiled. She had thought for so long that starting over meant losing what she had built. But now she understood. She hadn't lost anything. She had shed what didn't belong. She still had love, deeper now, rooted in truth. She still had work, richer now, free of performance. And most of all, she had herself, whole, visible, and finally, unmistakably home. Spring arrived early in Asheville that year, softening the ground and coaxing blooms from trees that had stood bare for months. Eleanor's studio window overlooked a dogwood tree, now blushing pink, its branches dancing slightly with each breeze. One morning, as she prepared a new batch of clay, the bell above the door chimed gently. To her surprise, it was Caroline. She looked different, less polished, more human. A canvas tote hung from her shoulder, and in her arms was a sleeping infant, bundled against the March chill. I'm not here to stir anything, Caroline said quickly. I thought you might like to know. His name is Thomas, after my grandfather. Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes settling on the child. He's beautiful. They stood in the quiet together, the only sound the soft hum of the kiln warming in the back. I've been thinking a lot about how we start again, Caroline said, gently swaying. How we break cycles before we even know they're cycles. How we learn from the people we once overlooked. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She looked at the child, then back at Caroline. Just love him, and make sure he knows that love doesn't come with conditions. Caroline blinked, then nodded. That's what I'm trying to do. I wanted to thank you, not just for the work, but for walking away when you did. It made a lot of things impossible to ignore. After she left, Eleanor returned to her wheel and began to shape a vase. tall, elegant, with deliberate curves. She wasn't sure yet what glaze it would carry. Maybe something soft, like moss. Maybe something bold, like flame. There was no rush. That evening, she sat on the porch with June, sipping tea as the sun dipped behind the trees. "You ever think about going back?" June asked gently. Eleanor shook her head with a quiet smile. "I didn't go anywhere," she said. "I just stopped waiting to be invited." This story isn't just about Eleanor. It's about all of us who've ever stayed too long in places that couldn't see us. It's about the quiet courage it takes to stop shrinking yourself just to make others comfortable. And the quiet power of reclaiming your worth, without shouting, without revenge, just by choosing peace. Many of us were raised to endure, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person. But there comes a time in life, not when we become hard, but when we become honest, when we realize that dignity is not selfish, that visibility is not vanity, that being loved should never require becoming someone we're not. Sometimes starting over isn't about leaving behind a marriage, a family, or a name. It's about returning, softly, fully, to yourself. You're not too old to begin again. You're right on time to belong exactly where you are, as exactly who you are. And that is enough.